The world of women's sport looks very different than it did 15 or even 10 years ago, and the same is true of women's involvement in the world of wrestling. It's been almost 10 years since the beginning of the women's wrestling revolution in WWE, and as the revolution evolved, it provided fans with many firsts, including the first ever all-female WrestleMania main event. A big part of this journey has been looking back at the women who paved the way for today's superstars, for enduring the heartbreak and the setbacks of limited match times and the over-sexualization of characters. But before the WWE began making changes, a lesser-known revolution was taking place at WWE's one-time potential rival, Total Nonstop Action Wrestling. Welcome back to One Fall Theory. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the creation of the TNA Women's Division, or as they came to be known, the Knockouts. The source material for today's content comes from the 2010 Dirty Dutch Mantell autobiography, The World According to Dutch. And if you haven't read this book, I really highly recommend it. Dutch writes as though we're engaged in a conversation with him, and he has some absolutely incredibly entertaining stories to tell, some that I would love to share in future videos with you, including wrestling a live bear. So please stick around until the end of this video as I'm going to share my thoughts on the Knockouts division, and as always, I'm really looking forward to engaging with you all and hearing your thoughts about the journey that women's wrestling has been on. Dixie Carter was for the idea, but wasn't sure of how she wanted women's wrestling to be presented. Dixie's exposure to wrestling was, in my opinion, based entirely off the WWE Diva model, as was Jeff's. The Diva model consisted of beautiful women with little wrestling talent whose strongest match was a pillow fight. Pillow fighting was okay if no one wanted to take it seriously, but I didn't want TNA copying WWE. My plan for the Knockouts was to have good-looking women who could actually wrestle. That way, I satisfied two groups of fans. One was males 18 to 49 who would watch the girls no matter what they did, and the other were the purists who watched them for their wrestling ability. I knew I could accommodate both groups. Still, at the time I brought it up, it looked as though nobody thought much of my knockout idea, so I shut up for a while, but I didn't abandon it. I looked one more time at the roster sheet and decided that we needed something entirely new and different. The X Division was great, and they had great matches, but we had worn out that horse. The tag team situation was good, but it needed a revamp. We could do all of that in the time leading up to Bound for Glory, but still, it's the same old, same old. We needed something completely different, and I had the answer. If there was ever an opportunity to establish a women's division in TNA, this was the time, I thought. I'd previously talked about the idea with Gail Kim, who I considered to be one of the top female wrestlers in the world, and we had some very enlightening conversations about female wrestling. Gail at the time was being used strictly as a valet to America's Most Wanted, and in my opinion, we were wasting her talent. Gail had told me that she wanted a chance to be a wrestler again, and to show that she could actually do a wrestling match. To tell the truth, I totally agreed with her. Gail and America's Most Wanted wasn't my idea, and to me it just didn't gel. AMW was a great team, but having an Asian American female in their corner was more WTF. I didn't feel any chemistry there. But I did feel some chemistry with Gail as an active wrestler. I talked to Gail about a TNA knockout division, and she was all excited about it. I could tell Gail wanted the spotlight to shine on her too, and I thought that if I could find a few more Gail Kims, this thing would work. I knew that for the knockout division to be successful and different, it had to have the ingredients that the WWE divas were lacking: actual wrestling talent. In Orlando one day at Impact tapings, I asked Gail rhetorically if, the key word being if, we started a women's division, what talent would she recommend? Gail thought for a moment, and her answer was quick and decisive. Gail told me a name. She said, Awesome Kong. I wasn't aware of Awesome Kong, but the name sounded great. Gail described her to me, and I knew almost immediately that my idea was looking better and better. Gail told me that she'd send along a link to a video on YouTube where I could get a look at this Awesome Kong. Gail sent the YouTube link later that day, and I got my first look at Kong. It was clips of matches in Japan, and I was blown away. Kong literally destroyed women left and right. I knew that if I got Kong to TNA, I already had a year of TV and pay-per-view programming laid out. Kong and Gail Kim would be the anchors to build a strong knockout brand. But first, I had a sell job to do. I had to sell the car to the rest of creative. Sitting in that room in our creative meeting, I knew this was my opportunity to bring the knockout division to realization. I knew what I had to do. Committees work by, well, committee. I had to sell the committee. I called it selling the car, but I didn't have the luxury of cash for clunkers. It had to be done. I opened my sell job with the following comments. Guys, look, we can go over and over this roster sheet till the cows come home, and the names ain't changing. The names were the same as they were last month, and the month before that, and the month before that, and the month before that. We have to freshen our lineup. We've got great talent, guys, but we need to be different. We need to start a women's division, and start it right, at Bound for Glory. It was a great hook. It's new, it's fresh, it's something different that we've never done. We can even blow out WWE at its own game if we do this right. We can crown the first TNA champion, which would give us another title shot on the card. We can introduce new talent, a new division, a new knockout champion, a new women's gauntlet match, and a new line of merchandise. Guys, this is what we've been looking for. Jeff and Vince listened. Mostly Jeff. Jeff's tone sort of changed. He asked, how many girls would we need and where would we get them from? At least now I had his attention. I've known Jeff since he was a 14-year-old kid, so I've always been somewhat in his world, and I know he has respect for me, so I said, somewhat kiddingly, that we didn't need that many. We probably needed about 10, but we have a few already. We have Gail, Christy Hemme, Tracy Brooks, Miss Jackie, and we would need 5 or 6 more girls right now. Where would we get them? Well, the population of the United States is about 300 million people, which probably scales down to 50% female, which leaves us 150 million women, which seems about 40 million would be in the right age bracket that we're looking at. Yep, out of 40 million girls, I think we could find 5 or 6 from somewhere. As I knew would happen if I just picked the right time and mindset, Jeff finally started coming around on my idea. I told him that I had several candidates ready to go, but truthfully I didn't. I didn't have any candidates at all, but I knew I could find them, especially with 3 months to go before the pay-per-view and with Gail's help. Hey, Bill Gates sold Windows on IBM, my apologies, before he even designed the program. Right now, all I wanted to do was sell an idea. I said to Jeff and Vince, the ratings need a boost, and we need something on pay-per-view. These girls will help us in both areas. What in the world would stop us from making the Knockouts a brand? I can't guarantee you the ratings or the pay-per-view buys will go up, but I can guarantee they won't go down. Jeff finally said for us to book it and gave me his go-ahead. I took the ball and ran with it. I made a few calls to TNA Talent Relations and told them to put down their donuts and coffee and go to work. I told them to get in touch with Awesome Kong and get her on board. I also told them it was time to find us 4 more girls who would work. I already had in mind ODB, Velvet Sky, and Angelina Love. I don't think anybody had much faith in the idea, but they were at least willing to give it a chance, and that's all I wanted. If I had a chance with the girls, I had a feeling that it would work. I based this feeling entirely off the Kong and Gail Kim, because Gail had endorsed Kong so strongly. I knew the success or failure of the knockout division more or less rode with me, but I wasn't worried. I had tons of faith in it. I wanted the knockouts to be completely different to the WWE divas. I didn't want them to be perceived as whores or bitches or sluts or the C word. I never did understand how we could try and upgrade a brand new property like the Knockouts and downgrade it at the same time. I knew you certainly couldn't sell dolls to little girls that were presented as nothing more than trashy sluts. Dixie signed off on the idea and seemed pretty happy with it. She ordered a nice title belt for the girls and we were getting ready to go. Dixie, it should be noted, was the one who came up with the Knockout name. The name had been in place for over a year. All I did was create and develop the idea into a marketable property. There was a market for competitive female wrestling, just as there was a market for competitive pro-women's basketball, or competitive pro-women's tennis, or pro-women's golf. I thought if we could present women's professional wrestling as a competitive sport, then we would have a market that would place TNA in an entirely different element from the WWE Diva model. We succeeded. We announced on Impact that we will be crowning the first Knockout champion at Bound for Glory 2007 in a gauntlet match. To me, that was a much better hook for the pay-per-view buying fan to get his $30 worth for the show. To put a spotlight on the Knockouts, on Impact, we introduced Awesome Kong for the first time. To get her over right from the start, we faced off against Gail Kim, who the fans really, really liked. Gail Kim was introduced first, and the people always responded to her really well. As they waited for Gail's opponent to enter the Impact Zone, they thought her opponent would be another perky, cute little female with a nice set of puppies and a cute little butt. But that's not what they got. When Kong's music hit, the fans got their first look at the 275-pound female killing machine, and they were stunned. I told Kong the day before we went to air that you never get a second chance to make a first impression, and Kong's first impression was great. Kong, at close to 6 feet tall and 275 pounds, was an awesome spectacle. Kong looked like a killer, and she worked like one as well. She had the look, the size, and the experience to get over. Kong beat Gail that night, and right in the middle of the ring, for the next year, Kong was the anchor of the knockout division. Things revolved around her. The idea of a one-night gauntlet match at Bound for Glory in Atlanta was one of the best ideas that we, as a creative team, ever had in TNA. It succeeded beyond all our wildest expectations. We not only established a new knockout division, but also crowned our first knockout champion in Gail Kim. We also introduced a lot of different girls that later on became the cornerstones of the division. Girls like ODB, Velvet Sky, Angelina Love, Salinas, Roxy, Kong. If I had brought any of these girls in by themselves or one by one, I don't think it would have had the same effect as bringing them in en masse. It created a buzz about the Knockouts division, and it still has it. I personally took charge of the Knockouts by laying out the structure of the matches, and Scott D'Amore did a tremendous job of agenting these matches and the girls in them. Everybody performed at the top of their game. Successfully kicking the whole thing off was Kong's debut, which was the textbook way to get a new talent over, and it worked. To me, that's how a new talent should be debuted, and when she beat the best in Gail Kim, she cemented her spot from the first day. Kong and the Knockouts got over instantly. Almost from their first matches on TV, the KOs started amping up the ratings. Kong anchored and controlled the Knockout division for the next 18 months. Kong beat them all. She beat ODB, Gail Kim, Roxy, Tracy Buck, Salinas, Angelina Love, Velvet Sky, Madison Rain, and a host of enhancement talent. I had a plan for the beginning on how to get Kong over. It was so simple, it was like stealing. The playbook for Kong had been written years ago, but I was the only one who still knew it was around. Kong's blueprint came straight from the Abdullah the Butcher playbook. Abdullah was a killer who just mauled his opponents. He got that blueprint from watching Abby's matches in Japan and Puerto Rico. I've never seen a female Abdullah, but Kong fit the bill. Kong didn't go off her feet for the first 4 months, and every time fans would see Kong, it was 2 minutes of ass-kicking carnage. Then Kong gave her opponent a ride on the Kong-sitting Powerbomb Express. I was told before the Knockouts were formed that I should expect a lot of drama from them, but nothing could be farther from the truth. Every Knockout wanted to be the best. Every time I spoke to them, I spoke of my passion for the Knockout division. When one of the Knockouts had a good match, it was as though they all had a good match. When the Knockout that had a great match came to the back, all the other Knockouts would meet them at the bottom of the chute, and they'd all do a group hug. I don't think I've ever seen guys do that. I had a few favourites, of which Kong and Gail headed the list, but I also grew to respect and admire all of the Knockouts. Each and every one of them was a pleasure to work with. Of all the things I did in TNA, helping create the Knockout division was my greatest achievement. I always felt a passion for those girls, some of whom had been in WWE, but loved the way that TNA treated them as serious performers, not pole dancers. The beautiful people, with Angelina and Velvet and later Madison, were all great. Tracy Brooks was a pleasure to be around, and Raisha Shaheed, Christy Hemme, ODB, Jackie and Roxy were exactly what I had in mind when the idea first saw the light of day. They were all characters who loved the wrestling business, and every one of them was different. Kong and Gail Kim held the Knockouts together for the first year. Gail and Kong literally blew the house away whenever they are locked up, whether it was on pay-per-view or Impact. We did a great job getting the entire Knockout package to work. Gail left TNA in 2008 and we all missed her, but it was over a contracting issue. It was always on guess what the guys would draw on Impact. Our top guys would sometimes draw a 1.1, and then the Knockout segment would sometimes come in at a 1.2 or a 1.3. The Knockouts were always steady performers, even when the top Knockouts weren't in the ring. I would say around 80% of the time the Knockout segments outdrew anything else we did on the show. That's why we always placed them on the top of the second hour of Impact. To me, the formula was simple. The Knockouts kicked ass, the Divas pillow fort. Okay, so I hope you found that as interesting as I did. Like I said, Dutch's ability to tell stories really makes you feel as though you're in those meetings and you're in the hallways with him. I thought it was really interesting to look back and really try and process the paradigm shift that Dutch was conceptualizing here. He kind of lays it out in a pretty casual manner in the book, but selling the creative directors of a globally broadcast television program to feature with prominence women's wrestling is nothing short of historical. The knockouts, yeah, like he said, it really did give TNA a point of difference to the WWE at the time, and you can even talk more broadly, as Dutch did, about women's sport in general, whether it's women's MMA or tennis or really any other athletic endeavour. I did, however, find it interesting that even in justifying the division, Dutch acknowledges that its inception was still targeted at male audiences. He doesn't really explain that a women's division was important because it would attract female fans or even female aspiring wrestlers. But I think it's really, really huge, and you can't really understate the value and the significance of representation with anything in society. So this was really a groundbreaking thing. Seeing something done well and given prominence, it plays a huge role in future ambition and success. Now, with all that said, as a teenage male, I have to admit that I absolutely loved watching the beautiful people's entrance, but the Knockouts matches were often the most memorable parts of TNA's events, as Dutch alluded to. The athleticism and the storytelling ability of the women was truly groundbreaking. Now, as always, I would absolutely love to hear from you in the comments. A few questions for you. What was your initial thoughts of the TNA Knockouts division? Did you think it was going to be a success? Did you only find out about it later down the track? Or perhaps were you someone that was never exposed to the TNA Knockouts division? Because if that is you, I would really encourage you to jump on YouTube or even join Impact Plus and take a look back at some of those early Knockout division matches and programs because they were outstanding. I really liked the company as a whole. What did you think, though, about the Knockouts division being on a brand that had the initials TNA? Did that undermine it from the start? Again, let me know in the comments. I think that's a really interesting discussion to have, and perhaps something I'll make a future video about. Do you have a favourite knockout match or moment? And finally, how big of an impact have the Knockouts had on the overall shift in the presentation of women's wrestling? Thank you so much for joining us for this video. Until next time, this has been 1-4 Theory, where we smarten up and smack down.